first, thanks for inviting me to talk about color in Dutch, because of course Dutch are a breed that I have raised since I was 10 years old, and I love them, and I love Dutch. And I think that keeping our color consistent is something that we struggle with in the Dutch breed, and in any variety, not just like blacks, blues, chocolates. I'm talking every variety has its own issues trying to keep its color. So I'm glad to talk about it because I've raised every variety except for chins. It's the only variety I haven't raised. I used to raise grays. I don't have grays right now, but I used to raise grays too. And each variety has its own challenges. So anyway, I'm glad to be here talking about Dutch. If you don't know me, I'm Kelli Slack. I am ARBA judge number 807. I've been around for a while, and I do love my Dutch.
And Kelly's raised rabbit staff for over 30 years?
Almost 30 years. It's 29 years this year, I think. So
that's awesome.
It's been wild.
And recently you just won Best Opposite Sex at the National Dutch Show with a chocolate buck.
I did, with a chocolate.
Yeah, which they had said there at the banquet that was the first time a chocolate has won Best of Breed or Best Opposite Sex since 1980.
1985. It was Evenberg and Stearns. So Dick Evenberg, who now just shows grays, he and his partner at the time, Kay Stearns, actually had Best of Breed and Best Opposite Sex, because I went and looked it up.
Oh, wow.
And they had Best of Breed with a blue and Best Opposite with a chocolate. Yeah, it's been a long time.
It is a very long time. It's not it's definitely a color that doesn't win as much at the national level. I mean, as seen with that statistic. So huge congratulations. I know getting to have my hands on that buck, he was absolutely incredible. Just so rich in color and bold and cobby and had the right kind of overall shape to him.
That's what we're breeding for. I keep breeding for more like him.
That's good. Yeah, he was round in every single dimension.
Well, again, I'm trying. We all try, but that is something that, so I'm going to confess, for a long time, I thought chocolates were really ugly. Like as a youth breeder, I thought chocolates were ugly. I was like, I am never raising chocolates. That is the ugliest color. I'm never going to have chocolates, blah, blah, blah. And in the mid 2000s, we lost a bunch of our chocolate breeders in Indiana. Like they passed on, or they weren't showing chocolates anymore. And there were kids that really wanted to show chocolate Dutch. And it was basically Wilbur and Wilbur Williamson and David and Megan Kylander, who were still breeding chocolates. And I think Mathis has still had a few, but not very many. And so there were kind of like 3 breeders left doing chocolates in Indiana, and there just weren't enough chocolates for all the youth kids that wanted them. So I looked at chocolates and I was like, oh my God, I still think they're ugly. I'm going to fix it. And so I made it my goal to breed for better color in the chocolates and to try to maintain good Dutch type, head, ear, whatever, but to get that dark chocolate color, almost the Havana chocolate color. That's what I want to breed towards, is that really rich, deep, intense chocolate color. And I'll talk about depth and intensity later, but the intense chocolate color that we were lacking, because it was almost a red chocolate, sort of a red toned chocolate, which just isn't as pretty on the show table. It doesn't have the same oomph or pizzazz as what a more blue toned or a more intense chocolate does. So there I was, the youth kid that said I would never raise chocolates. And now here I am, and I have been very diligently breeding towards good chocolate color for 10 years, I think, 10 or 11 years, that I have been just really focusing on my color. Again, trying to maintain those bodies and the head and the markings, but to really, really bring in the intense chocolate color. And it has been a journey, and it's been difficult, but I'm finally seeing more consistency across my litters in the depth of color and the intensity of color that I want. So, it takes time. When you're breeding for color, it's not something that you're going to fix in a generation or 2 generations. It's something that you continue to breed towards in order to fix it in your herd. Build the house before you paint it when it comes to markings. But when you are starting with like a really poor color in a breed, and there's not a lot of breeds out there that are like that. It was just that for some reason we lost our really rich chocolate color in Dutch. Then you have to start with really good color and then fix everything else. Because we lost all the modifiers for chocolate Dutch. I don't know how it happened. We had terrible eye color. They were this like light, pale red chocolate. They looked awful. And it wasn't until people really started focusing on breeding for better color and breeding for better eye color that we gained that modifier back, that we brought the modifiers back into play in order to get the dark chocolate, to then refocus on breeding really good chocolate rabbits that are now competitive. And it's not just my rabbits. Todd Biddle has some excellent chocolates that are very competitive. Lonnie Harper has some excellent chocolate rabbits that are really competitive, not just for chocolates, but for variety and opposite. Kevin Hooper's starting to get some really good chocolates again. He used to have beautiful chocolates, but now he's getting really good chocolates again that are competitive, not just for their variety, but for breed and opposite, and going like up for best 4 class, that are competitive animals. But it takes competition, and it takes dedication, and it takes people who are willing to step back from winning with a color and establishing the good color lines and then breeding. It took 10 years, right? Because I've had decent chocolates for a while. I won best of variety and best opposite sex variety at the ARBA convention with my chocolates out in Portland. That was like 2018? No, 17? 15, thank you, it's been a while. So, I won with chocolates out there, but I still wasn't getting the consistency that I needed to do well until the last 2 years. And part of it was that I was finally hitting my stride with where I wanted my herd to be with color, head, ear, bone, and type. So I was getting it all in, mostly packages, and I just had to fix my markings because I had built my house and now I was ready to paint it. And then I have been very consistent in what I've been producing for the last 2 years, because again, I built that house. I built the foundation of my house with a good head and a good ear and a good body and a good coat and good color. And now I could paint the markings on. So that's how I thought of it. I used to raise grays. I don't have grays right now, but I used to raise grays too. And each variety has its own challenges. So anyway, I'm glad to be here talking about Dutch. If you don't know me, I'm Kelli Slack. I am ARBA judge number 807. I've been around for a while, and I do love my Dutch.
And Kelli's has raised rabbit staff for over 30 years?
Almost 30 years. It's 29 years this year, I think. So
that's awesome.
It's been a while.
And recently you just won Best Opposite Sex at the National Dutch Show with a chocolate buck.
I did, with a chocolate.
Yeah, which they had said there at the banquet that was the first time a chocolate has won Best of Breed or Best Opposite Sex since 1980.
1985. It was Evenberg and Stearns. So Dick Evenberg, who now just shows grays, he and his partner at the time, Kay Stearns, actually had Best of Breed and Best Opposite Sex, because I went and looked it up.
Oh, wow.
And they had Best of Breed with a blue and Best Opposite with a chocolate. Yeah, it's been a long time.
It is a very long time. It's not it's definitely a color that doesn't win as much at the national level. I mean, as seen with that statistic. So huge congratulations. I know getting to have my hands on that buck, he was absolutely incredible. Just so rich in color and bold and cobby and had the right kind of overall shape to him.
That's what we're breeding for. I keep breeding for more like him.
That's good. Yeah, he was round in every single dimension.
Well, again, I'm trying. We all try, but that is something that, so I'm going to confess, for a long time, I thought chocolates were really ugly. Like as a youth breeder, I thought chocolates were ugly. I was like, I am never raising chocolates. That is the ugliest color. I'm never going to have chocolates, blah, blah, blah. And in the mid 2000s, we lost a bunch of our chocolate breeders in Indiana. Like they passed on, or they weren't showing chocolates anymore. And there were kids that really wanted to show chocolate Dutch. And it was basically Wilbur and Wilbur Williamson. and David and Megan Kylander, who were still breeding chocolates. And I think Mathis has still had a few, but not very many. And so there were kind of like 3 breeders left doing chocolates in Indiana, and there just weren't enough chocolates for all the youth kids that wanted them. So I looked at chocolates and I was like, oh my God, I still think they're ugly. I'm going to fix it. And so I made it my goal to breed for better color in the chocolates and to try to maintain good Dutch type, head, ear, whatever, but to get that dark chocolate color, almost the Havana chocolate color. That's what I want to breed towards, is that really rich, deep, intense chocolate color. And I'll talk about depth and intensity later, but the intense chocolate color that we were lacking, because it was almost a red chocolate, sort of a red toned chocolate, which just isn't as pretty on the show table. It doesn't have the same oomph or pizzazz as what a more blue toned or a more intense chocolate does. So there I was, the youth kid that said I would never raise chocolates. And now here I am, and I have been very diligently breeding towards good chocolate color for 10 years, I think, 10 or 11 years, that I have been just really focusing on my color. Again, trying to maintain those bodies and the head and the markings, but to really bring in the intense chocolate color. And it has been a journey, and it's been difficult, but I'm finally seeing more consistency across my litters in the depth of color and the intensity of color that I want. So, it takes time. When you're breeding for color, it's not something that you're going to fix in a generation or 2 generations. It's something that you continue to breed towards in order to fix it in your herd.
I do have a bunch of questions, but I know that you had some stuff initially that you wanted to focus on. Did you want to focus on that next?
Sure. So when I talk about depth and intensity, those are 2 different things that I look for in my herd. And I will have a little video for you that David will cut into this. So hopefully you'll get to see what I'm talking about. But I took some very short videos of some babies and some adult coats in black, blue, chocolate, and lilac, I think, so that you could see kind of what I'm talking about with depth and intensity. We talk about depth and intensity, and that's one of the things that I talk about a lot when I'm talking about color. And I have some little videos that hopefully David can cut in and show you for both babies and adults. So baby coats and adult coats in black, blue, chocolate, and lilac. And when I'm talking about the depth of color, I'm talking about how far the color extends from the tip of the hair shaft all the way down into the skin of the rabbit. So that's the depth of color that I'm looking at. And then when I talk about intensity, the intensity is how much color is there and how rich and how dark that color is. And our Dutch standard does call for more of a medium blue, but we always breed for darker blues in Dutch. And that's because it's very easy to lose those modifiers for dark color. So if we breed for darker rabbits, hopefully the idea is we don't lose those modifiers, even though our standard does call for a more medium toned blue. Because light blue, light chocolate, even light blacks, because blacks can be light, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good on a Dutch. It doesn't look good on any rabbit. So when you're breeding for color and you're trying to keep those modifiers, it's really important to continue to breed for more depth of color and more intensity of color so that you can keep that color as rich as possible. So when it comes to breeding for depth of color, we're just talking about extending that color down the hair shaft. And that was my first focus, was trying to make sure that I had rabbits that had color that extended really well down the hair shaft. So that's from the tip all the way down into the skin, and to get as much color down that hair shaft as possible.
Describe what ideal black color is, and we're just gonna go through the colors.
Okay, so ideal black color for me is a rich, glossy, dark black at the tip that extends into that medium slate blue undercolor as far as possible down the hair shaft. And that's something that I look for. In one of the videos, I have an adult that to me has good color at the top of the hair shaft but lacks some intensity of color at the base of the hair shaft. Like I'd like to extend the intensity down the hair shaft. And then when you look at the blue again in the video, that blue has the depth and intensity and carries it down the hair shaft. Now, I'd still like it to be a darker blue because we always want darker blues, but I appreciate the amount of color the animal is carrying on each hair shaft and how deep it extends down that hair shaft. And then when we come to our chocolates, again, I am looking for that intensity of chocolate color. And I'm also looking for that blue shade of chocolate versus a red shade of chocolate. And I'm looking for it to extend as far down the hair shaft as possible and be as intense, as dark as possible down that hair shaft. And I look at the same thing for lilacs, which of course are not accepted right now, but I look at the same thing with the lilacs too when I'm evaluating them for breeding, is how dark and intense is that lilac color? How deep does it extend down the hair shaft? And then I'm also looking for what they call that pink veil surface color that I wanted, the undercolor that I wanted. And I did that partially by bringing in a rabbit that was 1/4 Havana that was actually bred by Troy Erkey, because he had the idea to bring the chocolate Havanas back into the chocolate Dutch lines in order to recapture some of our lost modifiers. Now, of course, I bred that buck to a bunch of chocolate does that I selected. Wilbur Williamson, of course, was very helpful. That tinting that makes a lilac really look lilac, because I don't want a really, really pink or a really, really blue lilac. I'm looking for kind of that medium lilac color in terms of the shade on the surface. But then I want that color to extend as far down the hair shaft as possible and be as deep as possible down the hair shaft. Bought a doe from him. Melody Stromkowski had some very nice chocolates at the time, so I bought a doe from her. I bought a doe from Warren Wiltman. So I brought in several does, and then I also brought in some West Coast rabbits because, as we all know, rabbits vary from East Coast to West Coast, and you can find pockets of some really good animals all throughout the country. And it really depends on which breed you're looking for, where you go to get really good starting stock. But I actually went West Coast and found some really good chocolates out there from Dr. Scott Williamson and a couple of other people, and was able to then lock in the genetics that I wanted in order to produce deep, intense chocolate coats. But what I found that because I was focusing so much on getting my chocolates darker and richer, was that I did the same thing with my blues and my blacks. And so I started looking for the same things in my blues and my blacks. And then I looked at my torts and I was looking for that brilliant orange color over the top of the back with beautiful smoky blue shadings. But I was also looking for the depth and intensity of color. So because I focused so hard on the chocolates, I found that my focus bled over into my other varieties as well, so that I became more consistent in my color on all of my varieties. So when you start really focusing on the color in one variety, you may find that if you breed for other colors, that you will find that that intensity and depth of color becomes sort of a second nature that you look for in the other varieties as well. As I have to scratch my nose.
I can see that. That makes sense. That as you focus on the right kind of traits and modifiers within a variety to pull out that color traits, then you put a bigger emphasis just across your whole rabbitry.
Mm-hmm. But you have to be careful when you are breeding for color that you don't forget that type, head, ears, bone, and for Dutch especially markings are important too. You can't ignore the other pieces of the rabbit just to get color. And it doesn't apply just to Dutch, that applies to everything. Because as a judge, I've noticed that we have an ear issue across every breed, across the country. We have an ear issue and we have a head issue because we focus so hard on getting the type that we need. And we do have some beautiful type now, beautiful type, that we've lost some of the bold head and the thick substance of ear and the shape of ear that really makes a truly great animal pop.
And when you're saying type, you're meaning like the shape to the body itself?
When I say type, I'm talking about the depth of body. I'm talking about the width of loin. I'm talking about width and fullness in the base of the hindquarter. I mean, I've been in this almost 30 years, not quite, but almost 30 years. And I have watched the breeds change in those 30 years. And even the old time judges will tell you that our type has changed and improved significantly in the last 30 years. That we have seen a huge difference in the top lines where our animals peak, the width of loin, the depth of loin, the width and fullness into the base of the hindquarter across a lot of breeds. And you can still find animals that aren't very nice in any breed. But consistently, we are finding much, much nicer animals throughout all of the breeds, not just Dutch, but Florida Whites, Havanas, New Zealands, Californians, Satins, mini Satins. I mean, pretty much every breed that you're looking at, you can find some really beautifully typed animals in terms of their conformation. But we're losing some of that head, we're losing some of that ear. We've sacrificed that in our quest for deep top lines, wide loins, and wide full hindquarters. And so that's something that as I'm breeding for my color in my Dutch, I try to remember to retain head and ear and the overall shape and conformation of the body as well.
It's interesting. Yeah, it totally makes sense that, I mean, getting the perfect rabbit and having all the traits come together perfectly is really difficult. And sometimes as you're selecting for one, it comes at the expense of a different one.
It does. And what's interesting is you'll often find that does win with Dutch. So it's very common for the doe to be best of breed. It used to be that bucks won a little more, but now it tends to be the does. And that's because the does retain enough of their head and enough of their ear that they still look feminine, but the bucks don't necessarily retain enough of that head and ear to look masculine if they have a really beautiful body type. But if they have a really beautiful head and ear, they don't have quite as nice a body type. That seems to be the trend. That's what I've noticed in, again, 30 years, is that you either have this beautiful front end, this big bold head, this really beautiful ear, and not quite as nice a hind end, or you have a beautiful hindquarter, very deep, very wide, very full to the base of that hindquarter, but you've sacrificed some of that head and ear. It's not true for every rabbit. And those are the keepers, right? When they've got the head and the ear and the butt, those are the keepers. But a lot of times a doe will win because the doe is going to have enough head that it doesn't look odd paired with her really beautiful typed body. So that's just a challenge for our breeders. Breed better bucks.
It's funny. Did you have any additional topic that you wanted to go into before I ask some questions?
Well, we could talk about gray ring color.
Okay, that's fine.
So I had the pleasure of judging Open Dutch last year at the ARBA convention in Louisville, Kentucky, so 2021. And I was able to do the gray senior buck class. And I had a very deep class in terms of body type. They had beautiful top lines, very nice width of loin. They were very full to the table. But one of the things that we were lacking was consistency of color, and not just in ring color, but also in their eye color, because I noticed that a lot of the bucks were they were still a brown eye, but they were a light brown eye, that we were lacking some depth of color and intensity of color for a really dark eye. And it's something that I had noticed because in chocolate Dutch, that had been a problem about 10 or 15 years ago. Every chocolate Dutch that you looked at, okay, that was an exaggeration, almost every chocolate Dutch that you looked at had sort of a light eye, and they didn't have the modifiers to have a really, really dark brown eye. And in addition to that, they were kind of red coated. So when I looked across all of my gray senior bucks, I was noticing kind of the same trend, that they had sort of a light brown eye, that they didn't have a really intense intermediate band. It was there and it was wide, but it lacked the intensity of color that it needed to really stand out. It was sort of a pale tan band instead of a really rich intermediate band. And so that's something that, as a former gray breeder, I was looking for like if I got back into grays now, I would be looking for rabbits that had a darker brown eye and that had that really intense intermediate band with good rufous color, because I know that that is something that is lacking right now. So when you are breeding for your gray animals, it's really important to keep those modifiers for a more yellow cream belly color as opposed to a white cream belly color, and to look for that intermediate band that isn't just a wide intermediate band, but that also has good intensity of color that carries those rufous modifiers that you're looking for in order to have a really nice intermediate band. And take a look at the eye color on your grays and make sure that you are maintaining that dark brown, that dark chocolate brown eye color that we require.
Because at the end of the day too, when we have having all the different varieties of Dutch or of breeds, the defining characteristics of the color are what makes it special. And so it's a huge area of emphasis.
And most breeds, color gets like 10 points or 5 points. There's not as much emphasis on color. And I get that, I understand that, but you can't ignore color just to get beautifully typed animals. You can't ignore color just to get the biggest, boldest head. You have to remember that that color is your icing. It's your finish to the animal. It's the top, right? The tippy top of your little pyramid of things that you have to make sure that you are breeding for. Because if you don't have good color and there's another animal that is almost as nice as yours, but it has beautiful, rich color and a finished coat, because that always helps, that animal is going to beat yours just because it has better color. That is going to be a deciding factor. So you can't ignore color. You can't ignore breeding for color in the grand scheme of things. And it's hard with all of these moving pieces that you focus on. It's not, and I always think of it as, this is like my 5-year project, or this is my 3-year project, because you are never going to fix your problems in one generation of breeding. It doesn't matter if it's trying to fix the crown on a Holland Lop, or the ear length on English Lops, or density of coat in an Angora, or your top line in a Havana. It doesn't matter what you're trying to fix. You will never fix your problems in a single generation. It's always a multi-generation and a multi-year project. And that's something that I think a lot of breeders struggle with, is thinking long-term. It's, if I bring this rabbit in because I need this piece, and I buy a lot of pieces rabbits. I don't buy rabbits that are the complete package. I buy pieces rabbits that have the color that I need, or an ear that I need, or a head that I need. And then I've got a 2 or 3 or 4 generation project to bring that piece into my herd until I see results. So that's something that's really important to focus on, is it's a long-term project.
But let's dig deeper into that. So when you're going out and you're purchasing different breeding stock, because you have a goal of producing better chocolate colored rabbits, better chocolate colored Dutch, how do you piece that whole thing together? If you find this part here, that part there, and take us through the process as a breeder.
So what I did was, because I had no chocolates in my barn whatsoever when I started my chocolate project. I had no chocolates. I was raising blacks, blues, torts, and steels at the time. So I had no chocolates whatsoever, and I had to bring chocolates in somehow. So I started by looking at chocolates. I think I looked at chocolates for 1.5 years. I looked at every chocolate that I could find, not just in Dutch, but in other varieties, in other breeds. So I looked, especially the Havanas, because Havanas come out of Dutch. I looked at their color, and I looked at the intensity and the depth of color. And I do have an advantage because I'm a judge. So I was able to look at these rabbits on my table. But even as an exhibitor, I would go look at those animals in the cages. I would talk to breeders. I talked to Mary Henry in Himalayans, because she's had some beautifully colored Himalayans, including chocolates and lilacs. So I talked to her. I talked to, I can't remember her name. She's the one that brought lilac Havanas. Oh, shoot. Hang on.
Was it Spears?
Yes, Spears. I talked to her. So I was talking to, yes, Julie Spears.
I think so.
Julie Spears,
I think so.
about lilac Havanas, and we were talking about depth and intensity on lilac Havanas, and that was a few years in, but I find that talking to breeders in other breeds, not just your breed, is really vital to understanding how varieties and genetics and modifiers work, because you can listen to their experiences and then try to translate that into your own breed. So I looked at tons of rabbits in different breeds to try to figure out what it was that I needed to start with. And what it came down to was I needed to find absolutely the darkest chocolates that I could find to start with. And I ignored type, head, ear, and body, because and markings even, because the buck that I bought from Troy was a quarter Havana, 3/4 Dutch, and it was mismarked. He was a mismarked buck, but he had really deep, intense chocolate color. A couple of the does that I bought had very long stops, but my goal was to bring the chocolate color in first. A little bit like what Alan Barr has done with his golden yellows, is his goal was to get the color set. And once I got the color set, I could breed back up into the pieces that I needed. So I started with absolutely the darkest rabbits that I could find. Now, they weren't ugly, ugly rabbits, but they weren't beautifully typed. They didn't have the best head. They didn't have the best ear. And some of them were literally, they were mismarks. I even bred with does where I had a doe that had a really hard litter and she ate the ears off of her babies. And I bred with the earless does, not knowing if they had white spots in their ears and could pass it on. I was like, well, we're going to try it. They have the color that I want. If it doesn't work, I will, discontinue that line. So that means, yes, I would kill that line. Because a lot of it is experimentation when you are breeding for color, especially as you're getting started. So that's what I did, is I brought in absolutely the darkest color that I could find. And once I had my color established, then I started to introduce more of the type that I wanted. And I actually started breeding in blacks and blues because I wasn't afraid of getting lilacs. Lilacs are, as far as I'm concerned, the fourth table leg to your self varieties. So I was like, if I get really good lilacs, no problem. I will use them in my breeding program. If they have the depth and intensity of color that I want, and they have a beautiful pink veil, they're going to make nice chocolate babies. So that's fine. So I bred blacks and blues in that had the type and the head and the ear that I wanted more. And then started breeding again more towards the chocolates out of those animals. And I do still have a significant number of blacks that carry chocolate and blues that have chocolates in their background as well in the barn that I breed with. And in fact, out of all of the rabbits that I took to the National Dutch Show this year, only, I think 5 of them, and the 2 torts, we'll ignore the 2 torts. So 7 out of the 30 rabbits that I took did not have chocolate in their background in some way. And that included my 11th place black senior buck. Let's see. I think I had a 9th place blue junior doe that came out of my chocolate program, because black, blue, chocolate, and lilac are your 4 table legs to the self variety, or the self group, I should say, to the self group. And breeding the blacks and the blues in to reestablish the type that I needed was what I had to do. Now, that's not always the best way to go about it. Like if I had some chocolates in my barn, I still would have brought in a really deep chocolate color, but I would have focused a little more on the type and the head and the ear, because I would have wanted, more rabbits to show sooner. But my goal as a breeder at that time was to establish the darkest chocolate color that I possibly could, so that as I bred forward and bred for better heads, better ears, better bodies, that I could maintain that deep, dark chocolate color as much as possible. And I cull for color. It might be a beautifully typed rabbit. It might have like the best markings I've ever seen, but I cull those animals. I don't sell those animals to people if they don't have good color. I don't care how good the animal is in terms of type and markings. If it doesn't have the color to go with it, I don't sell the rabbit. because my goal as a breeder is also to make sure that other people are breeding the best animals that they can, because I like competition. I like to see, 40 beautiful rabbits on the table. If I lose to a beautiful rabbit, I'm like, wow, that was a nice rabbit. I lost to a good one. I appreciate that. So, in fact, I even bred my buck to 3 does for 3 different people, my best opposite sex buck at the National Dutch Show, because I'm nice. And I wanted to make sure that I had good competition. I want to spread the good genetics and have good competition.
So do you feel that picking those really dark, intense modifiers in the chocolate stock that you started with, does then that carry over into the right modifiers for blues and for blacks and lilacs?
Absolutely. I feel that absolutely. So I had always maintained the best, deepest, richest black and blue color that I possibly could. But when I said this earlier, but when I started breeding for those chocolates, I focused on it more. I paid more attention to it because, as you're going through the barn and you're looking at 60 babies and, you've already, lopped off half of them because they don't have markings. And then you lop off another half because they don't have the type that you want. So I've got like 15 babies left that I'm looking at. I'm flipping that coat open. I'm looking at the depth and intensity of that color. I'm turning that rabbit over and examining the belly color, because even on the self varieties, and it's not something that we do a ton as a judge, but as a breeder, this is something I do in my barn. I flip the rabbits over and I check their belly color, because I want to see the depth and intensity of color and whether it wraps from the top of the animal down into the belly as well. And that's something that I learned partially because I was a tort breeder, and we have issues with white tails on our torts if we don't carry enough of the shadings from the body down into the belly and the crotch area and then down the tail. We end up with white tails. And so as a tort breeder, I learned that it was really important to examine not just the saddle area, but also the belly of my breeding stock. And with my torts, if I notice that I'm getting a little bit light, I start keeping animals that are a little too dark for my personal tastes, because that will bring the modifiers back in to give me a medium tone on my shadings. And with my black, blue, chocolate, and lilacs, what I do is I look for intense belly color on the saddle, intense color on the saddle, but then also intense belly color to make sure that that modifier is doing what I need it to do all the way around the rabbit. So yes, I noticed a huge difference in the depth of color that I was keeping in my blacks and my blues because of my focus on my chocolates.
It's very interesting. Do you feel that, so with the modifiers that you were choosing, the ones that had more richness or more intense, that you feel is the proper or is more ideal color, when you were making those decisions, when the babies were, like you said, that you had 15 babies out of 60,
Yeah.
Were you making the decisions for you're going to keep these ones for your herd for the next generation at that point? Or when do you make that decision for what to keep for the next generation?
So it starts at day one for me. As soon as I open that nesting box, I start evaluating for color. And in fact, I almost brought babies in with me because I have some babies that are not going to make my cut because they are too red chocolate in their color. And I could see that in the nesting box. I could already see in the nesting box that those babies are too red chocolate, that I'm not going to be happy with the intensity of their color when they're older. They're going to be on that red spectrum versus the blue spectrum. And I talk about that because I'm a needle worker. And so I work with a lot of color with my knitting and with weaving and spinning. And so I look at those spectrums, whether it's leaning towards the red spectrum or the blue spectrum a lot. But I think it's a great way to think about it because you can almost see a red highlight on poorly colored chocolates versus seeing the blue highlight on good colored chocolates. And so that's something I look for in the nesting box. Like day one, I look at the skin tone of my babies. And then when they're about a week old, I go back out and I look again. And usually I'm right. Occasionally I've misidentified one at birth because if it's late, and I'm just flipping through, and I do take notes. I have cards on all of my does. So if there's a litter that I want to watch, then I'll mark it, because I don't know. That's just what I do. That's how my organized brain works. But a week in, I'll check them again, and I'm like, yep, that was definitely a red chocolate baby. I'm not gonna like this litter. I can already tell. Or wow, this litter looks great. These are all consistently dark chocolate all the way through, all 7 of them, even the miss marks. This looks great. I'm definitely going to keep an eye on this litter, and I will keep back miss marks to breed that have the color that I want, so long as they maintain the type that I want now. At the time, I would have just kept miss marks with the color that I wanted. But now, because I have mostly the type that I want and the head and the ear, if you're a miss mark, then, and you're in my barn and I'm breeding with you, that meant that you were good enough in all of the other areas that I'm ignoring your miss mark. And I do breed with especially a lot of mismarked does that have split stops or tied elbows. I don't breed with as many mismarked bucks, although I do occasionally, again, keep one that might have a spot in the neck or a tied elbow or a split stop, because the animal excels in so many other areas and has pieces that I want in order to keep a head or keep an ear or keep the color that I know I'm breeding towards. But I do occasionally breed with mismarked bucks. I can think I have 2 of them in the barn right now out of 24 bucks for 6 different varieties. So, and I do, because it's Dutch, I do tend to keep a few more bucks than I would have to if I had like Havanas or Mini Rex or Florida Whites. But that's partially because our Dutch genes don't always play nicely together. And so I can end up with an entire litter of like mismarked torts that I can think of right this minute. That as soon as they hopped out of the box, I could see their mismarkings, and every single one of them was mismarked. So I do have to keep a few extra bucks just because of the Dutch gene.
Because the markings don't breed true. Is that,
because the
or they don't, or that
always breed true. But that's also something I talk about. I start evaluating at day 1, and I look at them again at day 7, and I look at them again at day 14 when they're getting out of the box. And I look at them all again. My first cull through is usually at about 30 days. So between 28 and 35 days, I go through and I pull all my mismarks, and I have a cull buyer who will take my littles. And so it is a terminal cull, so they are killed and used for food, just fine. But that's my first level. So when I say, if I look at 60 animals, at least half of those are probably mismarks. So I know at least 30 of those are going away just for not being marked right. And about another half of those, so another like 15, are probably going to have not great type, because type can be difficult to establish and to keep consistent from the very first rabbit to the very last rabbit in a litter. So I just assume that another half of those are going to go away for that, or because they have spots in the eye. Thank you, Dutch gene. Or they have a blue eye. Also, thank you, Dutch gene. So, at 4 weeks, I might be down to 15 rabbits out of 60. And then at 6 weeks and 8 weeks, I look at them again. Anytime I'm in the barn and a rabbit catches my eye, I'm likely to pull it out and evaluate it and just take a look. How are you growing? Are your ears getting really long? We hit a heat wave last week. I have some torts that have little floppy ears right now. And I don't like that, because that tells me that their ear base isn't very strong. So I've marked those animals, and I will be watching those animals, as well as the related animals. So anything that came out of that buck or that doe in the future, I've now made a note, and sometimes it's a mental note, sometimes it's an actual note on a card, to watch these animals, because clearly the ear base wasn't strong enough to keep those ears up in the heat. They flopped down. So I am constantly evaluating, and I do that with my breeding stock as well. Anytime that I'm going to my cull buyer, I go through the breeding stock. Anything that's not on a litter and is in a cage is fair game, because you cannot, I know it sounds terrible, but you cannot move forward if you are keeping 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old does and breeding with them. And that's not to say that I don't keep a couple of pets around. I have this one doe that I love, and she's produced a ton for me. So, she'll probably stay in the barn until she dies a natural death, because she's like a pet at this point. And she's like 3 or 4 years old, and she was still producing. Like, I showed a daughter out of her at the National Dutch Show. I could keep breeding this doe, but I may just let her sit there and not make babies anymore. But if you are not constantly evaluating your breeding stock as well as your young stock, you won't move forward in your goals. You won't move forward in your project. And that applies to any breed. You need to have young breeding stock for the most part. The bucks, sometimes I'll keep a little older bucks, but again, that's partially because it's Dutch. And that Dutch gene just doesn't always play well with other Dutch genes. So sometimes I have to keep, 4, 5, 6-year-old bucks just so that I can breed back to them if I go off the rails marking wise.
So what do you keep on those cards or note cards that you're saying on the cages as they're developing?
So I have a system in place in my barn. I actually use cage tags. I just have white cage tags that I know are my litter tags. So every time I breed a doe, I just put, the doe's tattoo, the buck's tattoo, the date that I bred, when I have to put the nesting box in, because otherwise I forget, the day that they're actually due. And I tend to put the nesting box in on day 29, because I have bred my rabbits for so long and I have seen my own data for so long that I know I don't need to put the box in until day 29, because they will not kindle before day 29, at least not with a viable litter. And so I know, this is my date to put my nesting box in. This is the date that the does should kindle. And most of my does are 30 and 31 day does. I very rarely have a 32-day doe or a 29-day doe. And if it's a 29-day doe, it's going to be a tort. It will not be any other variety. It will be a tort. So I know my own lines because I bred them for so long and I have kept so much data on them that I can anticipate that. And then I mark down how many babies were born. I mark down how many were born dead. I mark down, if they die at like 2 weeks or 4 weeks, or, if she has any losses because she didn't have enough milk or whatever. I mark down, when the babies died. Sometimes I'll mark down colors. So if I have a doe that had like 7 babies and there's 3 chocolates, 3 blacks, and a blue, I'll write down 3 chocolate, 3 black, and a blue, just because I'll use those notes later, because I transfer them into a breeding book. It's just a basic breeding book. I put the date down, I put all the does that I bred that day, and then I mark down when all of the does kindled and how many, and I transfer all the information, how many they had, the colors they had, whatever. And that way I can flip back through my breeding book for a couple of years. I keep the books for 2 years, and after that I discard them. I used to put all of the data in my Evans Rabbit Register program, but after I had my daughter, it became harder to keep all of that in the computer. So I just have it hard copy right now.
Are you referencing that then? You had alluded to that before, like of, hey, this buck produces these traits, this doe produces like these modifiers.
So especially if I have a specific tort buck that is out of all of my old lines, and sometimes he doesn't breed well on a specific doe out of a pedigree, because I bred him to a couple of does that come out of that doe, and I can see that all the babies are mismarked. And because I keep track of, if I have to kill an entire litter, I keep track of it. Because I've done that, I can then go back and I can look at my pedigrees and say, well, okay, Tandy and Tasha are both out of, Tilda. And so anything that I breed to this buck out of this doe line is not going to have good markings, because I've now tested this on 2 or 3 does. I need to make a note, do not breed, Milton to anything out of this line. And you can do that with any breed. You can do that with, Havanas or Californians or whatever. There are certain lines that just do not cross well together. And knowing that is really helpful in your herd. That's why I keep track of all these things. I have, like I said, I just have my little white cage tags, and I transfer it all into my breeding book. Usually about once a month I go through and I'll just transfer all the tags at the same time. or I'll walk out there when I have a bunch of does that have kindled, and I'll note down everybody that's kindled, and then I'll put any more notes in my book from previous litters that I haven't transferred yet. And then, you know, that white tag will go with the babies. So the 1 to 4, that's the most I usually keep, babies that I'll keep out of a litter. And 4 is a lot for a Dutch breeder. Usually it's 1. I just transfer that white tag with the babies, so that the babies are always tagged in my barn and I know who they've come out of before I decide to tattoo. I don't tattoo most of my rabbits until they're 10 to 12 weeks old, sometimes older. Usually it's because I'm going to show, and so I tattoo because I want to show the rabbits. And what happens is, you know, they have that identifier white tag that just travels around the barn with them wherever I've moved the rabbit, so that I always know what rabbit it's out of, and I don't lose my information with that rabbit. But I sometimes I'll go through, and at 12 weeks old, that rabbit looks so bad that I don't tattoo it. I mark it to cull. And when I mark a rabbit to cull, I take their identifier tag and I flip it backwards so that it's blank. And I know that on my next cull run, I need to look at this animal again. I don't always, like, just because the tag is flipped doesn't automatically mean that rabbit will die. It just means this is rabbit you need to look at again because it's not meeting your standards for some reason. And they do go through the uglies. You know, a lot of rabbits will go through the uglies where they just don't look very pretty, even if it's 2 days out of their entire life. There's always a time when they're in their uglies. But I use those tags and tracking systems in my own barn so that I can continuously cull. You can't get better if you are not going through and getting rid of rabbits that no longer meet your standards. You can't hold on to the 6-year-old does. You can't hold on to 8-year-old bucks unless they're really special. You know, I can't have 25 4-year-old does. I'm not going to get babies out of all of those does, or enough babies in order to have rabbits to show.
Makes sense.
Well, and it was something, being at home during COVID and not going to the rabbit shows, I dropped the average age of the does in my barn from like 3 to 2. So the average age of the does in my barn is about 2 years right now. And I'm expecting 4 litters a year, which isn't terrible. I expect four litters a year out of a doe. I don't expect her to raise all of those litters, but she has to kindle babies 4 times in a year for me to want to keep her. And in addition to that, when I am looking at animals to keep, I'm looking at how many babies I kept out of that doe. So if she had 28 babies and I only kept 2, that's not a really productive doe. So that's a doe that I'm more likely to cull because she isn't producing well with the bucks that I have. And sometimes I do sell those does because they're still a good brood doe and they could work for somebody else, you know, at 1.5 years, 2 years old. That's still a prime breeding age doe. Totally fine. You can absolutely work with them, but it's not working in my program. So I go through and I bred really, really hard, and I culled really hard, and I got rid of a lot of rabbits. And I take 2 breaks during the year because I don't like to have does kindling when it's super hot out. So I stop breeding after about June 5th, and I don't start breeding again until about August 5th because I don't like those July and August litters. It's too hard on the does. I don't like losing does, you know, to pregnancy, to kindling. So that's one thing that I'm very strict on, is I try not to breed at all after June 5th. I don't want hot litters. I don't want dead does. And then in the dead of winter. So usually I stop breeding like around Christmas, somewhere in there. And then I don't breed again until the beginning of February. So it's a little shorter break, but I don't like having a bunch of late January, February litters. I don't like being in the barn. It's cold. It's miserable. I don't like it. So and I don't like bunny sickles. I don't like walking out and you have like 7 dead babies on the wire because the doe kindled and pulled no fur. And so I try to avoid that.
So do you keep the does then they had the 28 babies? If you kept 6 of them on there, that would be a doe that you would keep.
That's a doe that I would be more likely to keep and continue to breed as a 3-year-old doe. Yeah. But once they hit 4, a lot of times I move them on. When they start to get to 3.5, 3 3/4, 4 years old, they're out of my barn because the litter sizes are smaller. They're moving towards not being fertile anymore. So there's just no point in keeping them. And like I said, I have one pet doe that will stay in the barn. Her name is Aubrey. She's very sweet. Every time I think about killing her, I can't get rid of her because she's produced, I think, 10 or 11 babies and that I've kept out of all of her litters. And then in addition to that, another like 5 or 6 that I sold, and her offspring have continued to produce well for me. So it's a doe that, now I'm very fond of because she makes me nice babies. So she'll probably stay in the barn, and I will probably continue to breed her until she decides that she's just done, and then she'll hang out in the barn until she dies. But that's rare. I don't keep a lot of does or a lot of bucks either. I mean, I try to keep moving forward with my generations. If you don't do that, you stagnate. You can't keep breeding the same bucks and the same does over and over and over again and expecting to get different results. So you always have to bring the next generation in.
Do you use line breeding in your barn?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Line breeding is essential in any good program. You cannot rely on the chance outcrossings of 2 lines to produce good rabbits consistently. You can't. I line breed back on bucks and does. I line breed for various things depending on if I'm trying to lock in color, if I'm trying to lock in a head, if I'm trying to lock in, depth of body, because I know my rabbits and I know what they looked like. And photos are okay, but for me, I remember, oh yeah, that rabbit had a great loin and I need more loin. I'm going to, rebreed back on Hawk because that was a really good rabbit. He was really good here, but I remember he didn't have great fullness in the really lower hindquarter. So that's something I'm going to have to watch for in, these line bred offspring, and make sure that I don't keep offspring that have poor lower hindquarters, but that do have that good width of loin that I wanted. So I use line breeding constantly. And I don't bring in a ton of outside rabbits. And when I do bring them in, I tend to use them widely and then start line breeding their offspring as quickly as I can so that I can find any issues, so that I know if I line breed this line, I'm going to get a lot of white tipped ears, and I might just get rid of the entire line at that point. If I know that like Milton bred, if I breed 2 babies out of Milton and I get a bunch of white tipped ears, I'm gonna go, oh boy, and I'm gonna kill both of those rabbits, and I'm probably gonna go back and really evaluate whether or not I want to keep any of the other babies out of Milton, because I got all these white tipped ears, and that's something that seems to be very heritable in Dutch. Or I got a ton of low shoulders. All I get are low shoulders out of these 2 Milton babies that are bred together, or I will reevaluate those animals.
Do you see too then the consistency of those modifiers within the color that is locked in more because you're doing the line breeding? Or
yes, absolutely. So all of my chocolates are pretty much related at this point. In some way, shape, or form, they are related, because I started with kind of a core group of chocolates. I only brought in a few over the years, and I've bred in some of the black and blue. But they, that core group was what I started with. So everything is related to that initial core group. So there's always some degree of line breeding within my chocolate, black, blue, and lilac herd grouping. Because I think of it as I have 3 lines of blacks. I have my black blue line, I have my black blue steel line, and I have my black blue chocolate lilac line. And I actually mark all of my blacks. So if you look on my pedigrees, like HDHC Rosanna was a black doe. The C meant she came out of chocolates, so that I know that when I'm using her, I need to use her in my chocolate lines, not in my black blue lines. Not that I couldn't bring a buck in and use him, but that any offspring, because they were out of that chocolate line, would be marked with a C in my pedigree books, so that I know I need to use these more to my chocolate lines, not my black blue lines. And I could warn anybody who bought an animal, this has chocolate in the background, or this has steel in the background. And without even having to look at the rest of the pedigree, I would just know because in the name, I would have a C for chocolate and an S for steel. And that's how I would keep my black blue line clean versus my black blue steel line versus my black blue chocolate lilac line. Because I don't want to introduce steel into my chocolate lines. And I don't really want to introduce chocolate into my steel lines. And some people are looking for just clean black blue lines or pure black lines. I don't breed a pure black line. But that's a really important thing to think about when you are breeding for these color projects, is being able to quickly identify whether there's chocolate in the background or lilac in the background or whatever. Of course, if there's chocolate for me, there's definitely going to be lilac. And so that's a really easy way for me to mark that. So I remember. But I breed for those chocolate modifiers, and I breed for the heads that I want. And sometimes I'm line breeding, off of the same rabbit for, you'll see the same rabbit in 3 or 4 generations in a pedigree.
Because you've been using them that much.
Because I used that animal so heavily and I liked his offspring so much that I continued to breed and use those animals, because there was value in them. And as long as I don't end up with something really, strange, like, oh, everything that goes back to Jorge now has really low shoulders, then I continue to line breed back on those animals. But my core chocolate herd is pretty much all related. And even though I brought in some outside influences, at this point, they are super related. When you start looking back at the pedigrees and comparing, which is good, because when you buy rabbits from me, they're already related. So you're already doing a little bit of line breeding. And then when you're breeding your own stock in, it's easier to start that line breeding. It's really important.
When you initially, going back to those chocolates, like when you initially got them, like how many did you start with? I know you said you have it from like multiple different ones.
The first 2 years, I know I started with 2 bucks and about 6 does. And then over this next 2 or 3 years, I continued to bring in either chocolates or animals that carried chocolate. So I bought a black buck from Scott Williamson that was actually the litter mate to his doe that won best of breed at the National Dutch Show in Wisconsin one year. I call him Fred. I hope Scott watches this, because his real name is Ford Fairlane, but his tattoo was FRD, so I called him Fred, and it just bugs him so much. But I used that buck because he carried chocolate. Even though he was a black, he carried chocolate, so I used him pretty heavily in starting my chocolate program, because he had that beautiful head and that ear that I wasn't getting anymore, because I had bred and established the chocolate color that I needed. So I needed to get back the head, the ear, and the body. And so, I still bring in 1 rabbit every couple of years and I try them. But then I go back to line breeding and trying that rabbit and line breeding off of that rabbit, because I want to make sure that anything I bring in isn't going to cause problems later on down the road with my line breeding program. So
when you choose to bring in that extra rabbit, why do you bring them in, and what are you hoping for?
So when I'm bringing in extra rabbits, sometimes I just need an infusion of new blood, that because I like to line breed to a certain extent, but it's fun to buy rabbits from other people. It's fun to try new bloodlines and see if it will mix with yours. Not all of them do. Sometimes it's, wow, I love that ear on that rabbit. It's, it's round, it's short, it's thick, the substance, the fur. That's a beautiful, ear on that rabbit. I just want to bring it in. So sometimes I bring it in for a specific piece. The rest of the rabbit might be nice or not, but there's a specific piece that I see that has value in my lines in my breeding program. And, when I'm buying rabbits, I don't care how the rabbit did on the show table. I don't care. I care about how that rabbit looks and whether or not it's going to produce in my herd. That's what I care about. So it could no place, it could get disqualified. I don't care. I need that rabbit for a specific piece to bring in to fix something that I see as a problem in my herd. Or it's, that's a really beautiful doe. She's, fairly balanced, and I could use another chocolate doe. I'm just going to buy a chocolate doe and bring her in, see what happens. It actually happened to me last weekend. I bought a black doe that carries chocolate, not because I really needed another rabbit, but I was curious about her lines, and she had this gorgeous top line and some nice width in the loin. She was fairly full to the lower hind quarter. And she's a black doe that carries chocolate. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to bring her in, throw her to my bucks, see if I can fix that head and ear on this doe and get the chocolate color that I want. So we're going to try it. So sometimes it's just fun.
Sure. I like learning and hearing what people say on it. You've kind of alluded to it before as well, but what colors are really compatible in Dutch?
Okay. Currently, because we have 7 varieties, we have our black, blue, chocolate trio. Most breeders used to say just breed chocolate to chocolate because we didn't accept lilac, and they couldn't see a future in which we were going to accept lilac. So if you bred in black or blue, you ran the risk of getting lilacs in your litters, which was then fewer rabbits you could show. So they would say just chocolate to chocolate. But when you think about the self group, it is black, blue, chocolate, and lilac, and it is those 4 pieces. So when I started breeding the chocolates, I didn't hesitate to bring the blacks and the blues in, knowing that I would get lilacs that I couldn't show. I used to kill them in the nesting box just because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to show them. And I was really breeding for chocolates because I needed to establish the chocolates. But I stopped doing that about 10 years ago because the lilacs that I was getting were so nice when I would let them grow out that I'm like, you have so much value in my breeding program. I can't just, kill you in the nesting box anymore just because you're not a color I can show. I'm going to grow out all of my lilacs. So that's what I started doing. And I get some really beautiful lilacs. The chocolate buck that I won opposite with is out of a lilac buck. And that lilac buck was best opposite AOV last year at the National Dutch Show under Kevin Hooper. So he had to be okay. Kevin's not a huge fan of the lilacs, so he had to be decent enough that Kevin liked him for, opposite variety. But it's a beautiful lilac buck, and he carries the pink veil, and he has good depth of color, and he has good intensity of color, and it's carried to his son. And so, those are things that I looked at. It's all these things that you bring together, right? All these things that you bring together to make it work. So most of the time people will tell you black to black or black to blue, blue to blue, chocolate to chocolate. I have different lines. I told you earlier, I have the black blue line. I have the black blue steel line. And some people will put gray in with that, but you have to use poorly colored grays because we don't want ring color in our steels. And then there's my black, blue, chocolate, lilac line. So that's, again, because I feel like those are my 4 table legs. So if I'm going to be breeding, I need to breed all 4 of those together to get my best animal possible in any of those varieties. And then torts, I pretty much have bred tort to tort because we don't accept blue tort, chocolate tort, and lilac tort. And so I just didn't want to run the risk of getting those non-showable varieties. But honestly, at this point, yeah, I would absolutely take one of my black blue bucks or my black blue chocolate lilac bucks and breed it to a tort. You're mostly going to get black torts on the 2nd generation out of that anyway, because as we know, tort is the non-extension. So when you breed a self animal to a tort, you are going to get all blacks or all blues or a mix of blacks and blues and chocolates and lilacs. And it'll be the next generation down that you breed out that will give you torts because you have to breed it back to tort to pull the tort back out. So I mostly breed black tort to black tort, but Gene Kenealing had great success with bringing a black or a blue buck, I forget, into his torts and improving some of the traits in his torts. He does occasionally pop a blue tort. There's no reason you can't use those for breeding. You just can't show them. And that might change in the future. Eventually, it might be that we accept all 4 colors of torts. So it's tort, black, blue, chocolate, and lilac. But right now, if I was giving you advice on how to breed your tort Dutch, I would say just pretty much stick tort to tort, or maybe bring in a black that carries some blue, but mostly just stick tort to tort. We pretty much say gray to gray because you're trying to keep the modifiers and the ring color. And the chins are, sometimes people will breed in a black or a steel, but then it becomes hard to get the chin color back out just because of how the genetics work. It's not that you can't do it. It can be very successful and it can help to improve your chin, type, head, and ear, but then you've set yourself back a little bit on your color. And so there's always a balancing act. For steels, because I do breed steels, I fight the black dorsal stripe over the top of my steels all the time because I don't really bring in grays. I tend to breed black, blue steel, and blue steel. So I am constantly fighting the black dorsal stripe down the top of that back. And every so often I do have to give up and bring in a very poorly colored gray, or keep a poorly colored gray out of my steels in order to get enough of the ticking over the top of the back that I don't have a black dorsal stripe. But I'm still looking for the same thing. I want that black intensity, and then I want beautifully ticked and evenly scattered ticked hairs throughout my coats. On my torts, I'm looking for, again, that rich orange color. I'm looking for the depth and intensity at the top of the hair shaft, extending down into the base of the coat for orange. But then I also want to maintain good color in terms of shadings. You know, I want to see that smoky blue shading up around the cheeks and on the ears. And I want to see that smoky blue shading extending up the flank, but not too far up the flank. Usually right about the top of the hip joint is kind of where, or the leg joint, that's where I want my shading to kind of stop. And when I turn the rabbit over, I'm looking for the lap spots. I want to make sure that it has good shading on the belly, but that it also has the lap spots on the interior of the legs, and that it carries that dark shading over the tail as well, the underside of the tail. So I'm looking for the extension or non-extension of my tort color throughout when I'm doing that. And that's why it's so important to look at both the top of the animal and the bottom of the animal, so that you're evaluating both the saddle area and the sides as well as the belly color.
Perfect. I got two more questions. And you've partially covered this, but how does color change, like on the blacks, blues, and chocolates and lilacs? How does it change from kit to weaning to mature?
Okay. When it comes to how your color changes throughout an animal's life, you will see a lot of changes. The baby coat is very short, and so most of your color will look much more intense on a baby coat than it will look on an adult coat. So I am always initially evaluating that baby coat, but then evaluating again at about the 12-week mark, and again at about 6 months, and again if I've kept them to about 9 months, because I want to see how that coat is changing. Your dilutes are going to look more intense as younger animals. With each subsequent coat that they molt out, they don't always, but they can become lighter in that coat. The lilacs are especially prone to looking lighter with each generation of coat. So with each change of a coat, they tend to look lighter because that is a dilute color. They don't carry as rich of a color to start with. They aren't rich like a black is rich. They can be rich for a lilac, but it's a much lighter shade that they start with. So then when they are molting, they tend to lose a little bit of color with each generation of their coat. And as that coat dies back, it looks worse. So that's why chocolates and lilacs and blues, when they're molting, can look a lot worse than a black that's molting, because that hair shaft is now dead. And so it doesn't have, it's a totally dead hair shaft. It dries out, it becomes brittle, and you lose some of the intensity of color. So your best coats and your richest color are always going to be a brand new molted coat and a baby coat, for all of the self varieties. And you'll see that even in the torts, because they are technically a self that's just not extended fully. Anytime you have a dead coat, it's going to look lighter or a little bit off color, because it's brittle and it's dry and it doesn't have as much of that oil and water in it that's keeping it alive and vibrant. Because I mean, there's no blood flow to a hair shaft, right? There's no blood flow, but you do have oils and you do have water that are still being kind of whipped up into the hair shaft from a live hair follicle versus a dead one. So when I'm evaluating for my color, I always start as a baby. I check again at about 3 months. I check again at 6 months, and I check again at 9 months. And anytime I have an animal that isn't meeting my standards, it doesn't matter if it's a 1-year-old, 15-month-old, 16-month-old, 3.5-year-old, you're always on the chopping block in my barn. You're always on the chopping block. If there's a reason for me to get rid of you and replace you with an animal that I think is better, you're gone. Because that is always the goal of our breeding, is to continue to breed for better animals. And that includes evaluating your coats throughout the life of your animals.
It's very interesting. I like how you described how, and it totally makes sense, of the hair follicle being damaged and then not having that life, which then results in the way that we see it. Okay, so then my final question is, if you select rabbits that have great color, so if you select 2 chocolates that have great color, will they produce great color?
Consistency. So when it comes to consistency of color within a litter, even if you start with 2 rabbits that have what you feel is ideal color, whether it's blacks, blues, chocolates, lilacs, doesn't matter. The 2 rabbits that you feel have ideal color, you will not necessarily get an entire litter that has that ideal color, because that's life and it's genetics, and it's always how your genes mix together that results in the phenotype or the way your animal looks. So I can take 2 animals that I think have gorgeous color that are exactly what I want, and I can get an entire litter of rabbits that does not meet my personal standard for what that color should be. Because as those genes mix, you have to remember, each individual embryo is a brand new chance of mixing the genes, and they could all mix the same way or they can all mix differently, because each time it's a brand new chance. Just because we say, oh, if I breed a black to a blue and the black carries blue, I know I should get like half blacks and half blues. Well, that's statistics. And over the course of time, that may be true, but you could have an entire litter of blacks or an entire litter of blues, because every single embryo is an individual chance for the same thing to happen. So, I mean, I've bred for chocolates and had an entire litter of lilacs before. And I have bred for, rabbits that had really good color. And like I said, I looked in a nesting box and I know this doe has the color I want, and that black buck has the color that I want. And I should have had chocolate babies, because he carries chocolate, that were the color that I wanted. And they're too red. I mean, I looked in the nesting box and I immediately went, no, you're way too red. I'm definitely not going to keep you. But I've now made a little note on my litter tag that says this buck did not breed well with this doe. So I'll go back and compare pedigrees and figure out where I've gone wrong in my guessing on how to breed for better animals for color, and try to identify the buck or doe that is not breeding well with the buck and doe's lines, so that in my future breedings, I can try to avoid that and get the color that I want. So a lot of it really is evaluation and paying attention to your stock and taking notes and thinking about not just how the animal looks, because that is a lot of it. I go a lot phenotypically by how the animal looks, but also sometimes I have to go back and double check pedigrees and say, wow, this was a terrible, terrible litter. Why was it so bad? And figure out what line it is that buck is breeding on. And part of what helps is, if when I breed a buck, a lot of times I'll breed them to 2 or 3 does in the same day. So I have 2 or 3 litters that I can evaluate out of, hopefully 3 different lines. And again, they're all related, but sometimes there's one rabbit that, is just genetically different enough from its sibling or its half sibling that it didn't breed well with the buck that I chose or the doe that I chose. So when it comes to all of this, it's always a crapshoot. I hate to say that, but it's genetics. It is just genetics, and you never quite know what you're going to get when you open up that nesting box, even though we do our best to predict it.
But like you said, as you have more data, as you have more information, you are making educated guesses on you believe that this has a better chance of producing what the goal that you're trying to accomplish.
Yes.
But like you said, sometimes that doesn't end up coming true because we don't fully understand. And the genetics can be different than what we anticipate. But for the most part, the more times that as you predict and guess, you're going to be right more times through that because of the records and stuff that you keep. I think that's a critical importance of of trying to understand how to get there. But like you said, it's possible that it doesn't end up producing like we think.
Well, like, I mean, I have an entire litter of torts right now, 7 tort babies, and I started looking at them, and 4 of them have a white spot in their hind quarter, and 3 of them have tight elbows. That was a bad breeding for markings. It was bad, right? So I'm going to go look at my pedigrees and say, okay, this buck and this doe, what do they have in common and what don't they have in common? Because the one they don't have in common is most likely to be the culprit. And so then I will make sure that I don't breed that buck to does that have, that, and don't breed the doe to bucks that have the other one. So yeah, it happens.
Totally makes sense. Those are all the questions that I have, unless you had something else that you wanted to hit on. I definitely appreciate your time, and it's very interesting. I mean, you've been working on, going back to the beginning, you've been working on very hard to produce that awesome color, and by making that the building block or foundation that you started from, and picking out those genetics led to the success of you winning, best opposite sex at the national level, and producing an animal that was stunning in every respect.
That rabbit actually goes back to my very first Dutch ever. It's 15 generations. Wow. 28 years of breeding, 26 consecutive national Dutch shows because we didn't have one with COVID. A lot of work and time and effort, and just really a lot of evaluation and record keeping and paying attention. But all the way back to my very first black Dutch doe from Bob Burgundy, I can trace that rabbit. And through a lot of my favorite lines and favorite rabbits, and this rabbit, this was Dirk, he was a good blue buck. I suppose, there he is. That was a really good blue buck. I took a photo and
he looks black. Made.
I know he looks black, but he was so dark.
Okay.
And it's hard to see, but he was blue. He was so dark. He was a really dark, beautiful blue buck. But yeah, just lots and lots of breeding and evaluating and culling. And I did basically what Alan Barr did with his golden yellows. He brought the color in. He is establishing the color that he wants first. And when he gets that color established, then he'll start really focusing on heads and ears and bodies and getting the rabbits that he wants, because he'll have the color locked in. So that's, and it's funny that I did it long before he did it, and we both had the same idea, and it will work. It absolutely will work for him because it worked for me.
Trying to pull up the video of that buck real quick.
Oh, I know, I have a whole bunch of little short videos I took.
And the video, I'll have to reinsert the video, but I mean, that's, I don't know, I love the roundness of this buck. I mean, every dimension. I love how round his head is, how thick his substances of his ears is. When you flip him over, how massive the wide bone is.
Well, and how dark his eye is, and the depth of color that he carries throughout. And I'd still like him darker. I always want darker. And you can see that his coat is starting to change a little bit, because you can see a little bit of modeling in that chocolate color, which you don't usually get in the blacks, because the way that it appears to our eye, you don't see it as much. So you see it more in the dilutes than you do in the blacks, which is harder. That's why it's harder for dilutes to win, because there's more variation in their color because of how the tones appear to our eyes.
Yeah, but I mean, just every dimension of him is round.
Yeah. But anyway, and I'd still like him to be more intense in that chocolate color. I like the depth that he carries to the skin, but if I could get more intensity, I would take it. So
Always a breeder.
I'll,
Again for your time.
absolutely. It's always good talking with you, David. I
Thanks
love
for
that
coming.
picture of us with the buck.
That was
Love
good.
it.
It was.
Yeah.
I'm glad we did that.
I am too. I'm really glad we did that.